This is the horrifying story of a shark encounter during a research dive in one of the world's deepest underwater holes. St. Croix is a small island but is part of the U.S. Virgin Islands and is just east of Puerto Rico. As with most tropical islands, the water is perfect for sporting all sorts of sea life and rich coral reefs, making it ideal for diving. And although the entire island is surrounded by rich diving spots, there is one spot in particular that is famous because of a unique feature. This is a spot known as the Cane Bay Wall. What makes this spot unique is that just a couple of hundred feet from the shore, the water goes from 40 feet deep to 13,000 feet deep in a single, almost vertical drop. This means that you can stand on the edge of this wall and look out into a bottomless abyss that would swallow up most of all but the tallest mountains in the continental United States. This is one of the largest vertical drop-offs anywhere in the ocean. In November of 1996, 3 commercial divers were diving that area of St. Croix, conducting research on the sea life of the Cane Bay Wall. They had set up some traps a week earlier, and now they were going to collect the samples, as well as take some other measurements. All 3 of these individuals were highly experienced divers, each having hundreds of dives under their belt. So between the 3 of them, they had over 1,000 dives worth of experience. Once they were at the depth of the traps, which is around 220 feet or 67 meters, 2 of the men, Brett and Robbie, got to work taking samples. The third man, Rod, was keeping track of their depth and timing and noticed 2 oceanic white-tipped sharks swimming along the wall in the distance. As experienced divers, the men were entirely unfazed by this. Shark sightings are just a normal part of diving in the ocean. It was a bit rare to see these open water species so close to land, and they were also unusually large at around 14 feet long, so the 3 men stopped briefly to take some pictures before continuing on with their work. After spending their planned 15 minutes or so working at depth, they reached about the halfway point in their dive. This meant that it was now time to head back up to the surface. Their planned descent would have Robbie go first, then Brett, then Rod come up last. When they started to ascend, Robbie's air reading was a bit lower than expected because he had just been breathing a little bit heavier throughout the dive, so Brett told him to head on up to a shallower depth. Then Brett started to swim as well and noticed that Rod was pointing back down to where Rod was, who was still down on the wall. Brett looked down and saw that Rod was covered in silt, like a dust cloud covering him completely. To Brett, it looked like Rod might have had a hose here, causing air to spray around and kick up the silt on the wall. This also meant that he might be leaking air and might need some extra air, so Brett swam back down to see if he needed any help. It was only once he got into the cloud of silt and got a better look that he could see that there wasn't a hose at all. Brett grabbed him and started pulling him and realized that Rod had a huge bite mark on his thigh. And as he was processing what he was seeing, the shark came in for another attack. The 2 of them tried desperately to hit its gills and keep it away, and as they were fighting it off, a second one swam in and grabbed a hold of his calf, causing the silt to become blood red. Then the first one came back and grabbed his thigh again and started pulling him violently. Even though Brett was pulling hard in the opposite direction, the shark was too strong and pulled the 2 of them right over the edge of the drop-off. Now in essentially a free fall down the wall, the 2 of them tried desperately to fight off the shark while also rapidly consuming the air they had left. At one point, Brett checked his depth gauge and saw that it was maxed out at 325 feet, meaning there were some number of feet beyond what his depth gauge could even read, and still descending. Finally, there was a brief break in heat, and Brett pulled the 2 of them into a small sandy cove in the wall. It was there that he finally had a chance to get a better look at Rod's condition, and he was horrified to see that Rod's left leg was almost completely torn off. Most of the tissue was gone, and he also had serious bites to his stomach and chest. Upon seeing this, Brett basically went into full panic mode and grabbed Rod and started swimming up as hard as he could. But within just a few seconds, the sharks came back and grabbed Rod again, pulling them both back down the wall. And as if things couldn't get any worse, Brett went to take a breath, and it felt like he was pulling the air through a straw. This meant that he had just a few breaths left before he was completely out of air. Then another second later, the sharks ripped Rod right out of his hands, and Brett watched helplessly as they pulled him deeper into the water. Almost out of air now himself, there was just nothing he could do to help Rod anymore, so he had to refocus on saving himself. Unfortunately, he was still at close to 400 feet of depth with almost no air. He started frantically swimming up towards the surface, and at one point he checked his depth gauge and saw that it was still redlined at 325 feet. Between the depth, the panic, and nitrogen narcosis, he just focused intensely on making strong rhythmic kicks towards the light up above. He swam, and slowly his vision started to close up on it, like a tunnel. As he swam, this tunnel got smaller and smaller until he had one final thought, which was that he was so close and that he passed out about 30 feet from the surface. Miraculously, his buoyancy device had just enough air in it to float him up to the surface and bring his head out of the water. Then, the pressure difference forced him to exhale and kick-started his breathing, and he woke up gasping for air. He took a few moments to look around and get his bearings and take in everything that had happened. Unfortunately, the third member of their team, Robbie, had already left to get help. The last thing he saw was the two of them go over the wall, covered in blood, so the reasonable thing to do was assume they were dead and go get help. Now, because of how deep Brett had been and how quickly he resurfaced, he was already starting to suffer from decompression sickness. He had to get to shore quickly or he risked passing out or becoming paralyzed. He got into shallow water, ripped off his scuba gear, and then ran to the nearest couple on the beach. He quickly told them who he was and that he had decompression sickness. Then he told them which truck was his, where his keys were, and that there was a clipboard on the dashboard with emergency instructions. And just as he finished giving them those instructions, he passed out again. And although this was obviously a terrible situation, Brett was also incredibly lucky, because the couple he had run into was a doctor and a nurse, who were also familiar with decompression sickness. They quickly ran to his truck, grabbed the instructions, and then ran over to the phone at a nearby hotel. They called the Marine lab he was employed by, who quickly called a medevac plane to come get him. And then from there, he was airlifted from Croix and flown to Puerto Rico because there weren't any decompression chambers on the island. Then, almost like something out of a movie, they ran out of oxygen on the plane he was in and had to land it on a high rig, which was also coordinated with a helicopter landing to take him the remaining distance to the hospital. Finally, he got into a hospital and made an almost full recovery with some lasting effects from the decompression sickness. Unfortunately, Rod's body has never been found. Brett would later learn that there was a ship in the area emitting a low-frequency vibration that had attracted the sharks in the first place. It just wasn't known at the time that this could occur, ultimately resulting in the brutal attack.